manufacturing sector. Introduction. The industrial sector is widely recognized for its pivotal role, particularly in terms of being at the center of the dynamic intersectoral linkages needed to accelerate the process of economic transformation. Manufacturing sector is one of the subsectors under the industrial sectors, others being processing, craft and mining. The contribution of this subsector to Nigerian GDP will be discussed in this study section. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this section, you should be able to discuss the factors that influence the structural changes and performance of manufacturing sector in Nigeria. Explain the impact of this sector to export earnings of the economy. Highlight the significant contribution of manufacturing sector to the overall performance of the economy. Performance and structural changes in Nigeria's manufacturing subsector. Performance. The factors that influence the structural changes and performance of the manufacturing subsector since independence include government intervention, low technological development, inward-looking strategy, and protectionism. As in other developing economies, the main objectives set by the industrial planners in Nigeria include the desire to achieve increase in the share of manufacturing contribution to the GDP, replacement of imports with locally produced goods, innovativeness, industrial dispersal, and employment generation. The performance of the manufacturing subsector is therefore assessed employing criteria such as its share, value added in GDP, manufacturing production index, which reflects changes in the level of aggregate output relative to a specific base year period, and plant capacity utilization rates. Other yardsticks include the growth and diversity of manufactured exports, degree of industrial dispersal, employment generation, level of local raw materials utilization, foreign exchange saving, and industrial self-sufficiency. The pre-structural adjustment program era, spanning the 1960s to the mid-1980s, witnessed the adoption of various policy measures and strategies designed to promote industrial growth. At the outset, Nigeria as an inward-looking economy adopted the import substitution strategy, which encouraged manufacturing units but with heavy dependence on imported inputs. Thus, with huge inflow of direct foreign investment capital, massive revenues from oil export and liberal importation policy, a large quantum of essential industrial raw materials, machinery and equipment were imported to boost manufacturing activities in Nigeria. The net import requirement of the manufacturing subsector grew rapidly, as more than 60% of the raw materials consumed in the subsector were imported. The high import dependency was more pronounced in the heavy capital-intensive industrial subgroups. This induced steady output growth averaging 11% per annum in the manufacturing subsector in the 1970s, while its share in GDP also increased from 5.4% in 1977 to 1978, 1984 constant prices to a peak of 13% in 1982. Manufacturing production from the mid-1970s up to 1981 reflected the incentive framework which favored the supply of locally produced goods to the domestic market. Most investment incentives provided by government were targeted at achieving higher production and greater revenues in the medium to long run. The exchange rate system, as the basic factor affecting the cost-price structure and competitiveness of manufactured products, became a major determinant of the net incentives and the structure of the manufacturing subsector producing mainly for the domestic market. The macroeconomic policy implemented facilitated naira appreciation, thus giving protection to the import-dependent industries. Selective or directed credit policies for preferred sectoral investment programs were implemented. In particular, the loan rate ceilings used in conjunction with imports restrictions encouraged industrialization through import substitution. The overall manufacturing capacity utilization as a result of the overvalued naira and the substantial supply of imported raw materials under the protective regime rose markedly but fluctuated between 75 and 70% in the period 1975 to 1980. Many manufacturing enterprises, including multinationals, grew behind high protective fiscal barriers, making huge profits in the 60s and 70s. The period 1982 to 1986, however, stood in sharp contrast to the earlier years as the growth of the import-based consumer goods and assembly-oriented industries contributed little to domestic value added. With the collapse of oil prices in the international market, foreign exchange supply from oil export declined drastically during 1982 to 1985. The oil revenues, which accounted for about 90% of foreign exchange earnings, fell from 25.4 billion US dollars in 1980 to less than 6 billion US dollars in 1986. Although foreign exchange supply was rationed in favor of industrial raw materials, spare parts, and semi-assembled products of selected industries, the quantum of imported raw materials and spare parts fell commensurately with available foreign exchange. The performance of the manufacturing subsector, therefore, deteriorated in the early 1980s. Manufacturing production fell by an average rate of about 1.5% per annum from 1980 to 1984. The substantial reduction in the subsector's gross investment and capacity utilization, rated attributed largely to scarcity of foreign exchange, led to low value added, high production cost, and low production for exports. Also, the improvement in the manufacturing production, induced largely by output boosting measures contained in the Structural Adjustment Program (SAP), could not be sustained. Thus, average annual growth in manufacturing output fell from 13.0% in the period 1985 to 1989 to 0.2 and 1.9% for the periods 1990 to 1994 and 1995 to 1998, respectively. Variations in production level occurred among the manufacturing subgroups between 1982 and 1986. While the breweries thrived with the highest annual output growth rate, most industries experienced severe difficulties. The largest contractions were recorded by cotton textile, soap and detergents, pharmaceuticals, and vehicle assembly plants. Manufacturers' inward production orientation and their inability to sustain increasing importation of raw materials, difficulties in replacing obsolete machinery and equipment, impact of overvalued naira exchange combined to depress the level of exports. Question: highlight some of the factors that influence structural changes in the manufacturing subsector of Nigeria. Feedback: some of the factors that influence structural changes in Nigerian manufacturing subsector are government intervention, low technological development, inward-looking strategy, and protectionism. Economic policy reforms in the manufacturing subsector. The faltering domestic manufacturing production, together with the low quantum and little diversity of Nigeria's manufactured export, has been attributed largely to the prolonged implementation of import substitution strategy. This, therefore, necessitated the restructuring of productive activities in the manufacturing subsector by a shift in industrial policy strategy under the framework of SAP in mid-1986. SAP was introduced, among others, to revitalize the manufacturing subsector, diversify the economy away from its heavy reliance on oil revenues, and improve the economy's future growth. The basic features of SAP that were intended to improve manufacturing performance include the removal of exchange rate overvaluation and its subsequent determination by market forces, tariff reforms, removal of price controls to enable producers operate competitively, public sector reforms including the privatization and commercialization programs, and fiscal prudence. The adoption of SAP in mid-1986 brought a modest revival in economic growth and renewed capital inflows. The SAP underscored the symbiotic relationship between the manufacturing subsector and the agricultural sector, as it strengthened the intersectorial linkages between them and fostered outward production and trade orientation. The shift towards intensive use of local material resources and a more liberal foreign exchange allocation regime achieved temporary revival in growth. Moreover, SAP-based policies encouraged increased private sector participation and reduced government direct involvement in business enterprises. Manufacturing production grew by an average of 8.1% between 1987 and 1992. The domestic resource-based industries such as beer and stout, cotton textile, cement and roofing sheet performed relatively well, while the reverse occurred for the import-intensive low-value added unit, exemplified by electronic products, vehicle assembly and machinery and equipment. The overall manufacturing capacity utilization rate, which fell from 42% in 1984 to 37.1% in 1985, increased slightly to 38.9, 40.4, 41.5, and 42.4% in 1986, 1987, 1988, and 1989, respectively. The growth momentum in the subsector, however, could not be sustained for long, as manufacturing production was seriously hampered by frequent breakdown of infrastructural facilities, particularly incessant electric power outages, increased production costs associated with market-determined exchange and interest rates, and low effective consumer demand, resulting in huge stocks of unsold goods. The substantial devaluation of the naira during 1986 to 1988 led to escalation of cost of imported inputs. In addition, the restrictive monetary policies of 1986 and 1987 reduced credit to the productive sector and also seriously hampered growth in effective demand for finished products. The rising cost of import and private generation of electricity and other vital infrastructures to sustain production processes resulted in high production costs, increase in product prices, and consequent low consumer demand. Also, the persistent depreciation of the naira and its inflationary impact increased cost of production by adversely affecting both locally sourced materials as well as imported inputs. Arising from this development, the manufacturing subsector, which was expected to achieve 15% value-added contribution to the GDP, thus serving as the major source of growth, registered dismal performance instead. The share of manufacturing value added to the GDP averaged 7.4% between 1986 and 1995. Average manufacturing value added reflected an average increase of 2.74% between 1986 and 1995, in contrast to an average decrease of 1.3% between 1995 and 1997. However, manufacturing output as measured by the production index decreased at an average of 0.73% between 1995 and 1998. Average capacity utilization rate was 36.9% between 1986 and 1998, which was lower than the 65.1% achieved between 1975 and 1985. Question: what were the basic features of SAP that were meant to boost the performance of the Nigerian manufacturing subsector? Feedback: these SAP features include removal of exchange rate overvaluation and market forces determination, tariff reforms, removal of price controls to enable producers operate competitively, public sector reforms such as privatization, commercialization, and fiscal prudence. Export of manufactures. In spite of the effort to shift production and trade towards outward orientation, the manufacturing subsector is yet to make any significant contribution to export earnings. Export of manufactures was unable to take advantage of the sharp naira depreciation to widen the market for manufacturing subsector owing to other overwhelming adverse factors. Aggregate value of manufactured export comprising textiles, beer, cocoa, butter, plastic products, processed timber, tires, natural spring water, soap and detergent, and fabricated iron rod accounted for 1.9, 2.1, 7.1, 21.2, 16.8, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, and 0.4% of total non-oil export in 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1994, 1995, 1996, and 1997 respectively. Table 5.6, it accounted for less than 1.0% of total exports. Manufactured export is dominated by the textile group, which accounted for 59.8, 72.8, and 75.0% in 1987, 1988, and 1989 respectively, before decreasing to 22.9% in 1990. The poor performance of manufactured export is explained by low technological base, substandard export products, uneconomic scale of production, lack of diversification of export commodities, and price uncompetitiveness. Average capacity utilization. Average capacity utilization in the manufacturing sector was very high in the 1960s up till early 1980s. It was over 78.0% between 1970 and 1980. However, in the 1980 to 1990 period, average capacity utilization fell drastically to about 49.0% and reduced further to about 36.0% in the late 1990s. Since year 2000, it has been hovering between 36% and 57%. It can therefore be concluded that average capacity utilization was very high during the period 1960 to 1970 and fell drastically since then. The growth performance of the manufacturing on the annual average between 1960 and 1970, and this rose to 11.7% in the year 1970 to 1980. It is pathetic that the growth performed the sector in the mid-1980s and 1990s was very poor. The data reveals that the average growth per annum remains around 1.0% since 2000. Comparing the growth performance of the manufacturing sector with the other sectors of the economy, it can be observed that during the 1960 and 1970 period, manufacturing sector performed better than agricultural sector, transport and commerce sectors. On the other hand, mining and quarrying, electrical and water, and building and construction performed better than the manufacturing sector. Further, during 1970 and 1980 period, manufacturing sector performed better than other sectors of the economy except agriculture. It should be noted that some sectors of the economy recorded relatively high growth rates in the 1990s and 2000s, while the rate of growth the manufacturing sector was less than 1.0% during this period. Question: what do you think explains the poor performance of the Nigerian manufactured export in recent times. Feedback. The major causes of the poor performance in the Nigerian manufactured export in recent times are low technological base, substandard export products, uneconomic scale of production, lack of diversification of export commodities, and price uncompetitiveness. Output growth contribution. The contribution of manufacturing sector to the overall output of the economy GDP has not been substantial over time. It was a little above 7.0% in 1970 and declined to 5.6 and 5.4% in 1975 and 1980 respectively. It rose to a peak of 11.0% in 1985 and fell to about 8.0% in 1990 and remains around 6.0% in 1990s and 2005. Export contribution. In terms of export contribution, the performance of the sector is nothing to reckon with. The share of manufacturing sector, which was 7.4% in 1970, fell to 1.1% in 1975. It was less than 1% in the 1980s, except in 1998, when it was 1.7%. This shows weakness of the sector in Nigeria exports. The rate of import of manufactured goods was very high in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1990s and 2000s, the rate remains high, although lower than that of the previous decades. This shows that Nigeria is an import-dependent economy, particularly in the manufacturing sector of raw materials and capital goods imports. Question: is Nigeria an import-dependent economy? Then why? Feedback: yes, Nigeria is indeed an import-dependent economy because over the years, the rate of import of manufactured goods outweighs the rate of export of manufactured goods. Study session summary. In this study session, you learned that manufacturing sector is a subsector under the industrial sector. This sector engages in the physical or chemical transformation of raw materials or substances into raw products. The performance of this sector has been very disappointing over the years, and this has prompted government intervention in one way or the other. Economic policy reforms in the manufacturing subsector have been attributed largely to the prolonged implementation of import substitution strategy. This sector is characterized with many peculiar problems that are militating against its performance. This is the end of section 5. Thanks for listening.